that they tend to shy away from or even be cowardly about the information space. And this is not about information operations or psyops, but just engaging with the public in the information space. Military commanders never run from the sound of fire. They don't let weather stop them. So why on earth are they so cowardly around somebody with a pad and a pencil?
Hello, and welcome to the Vet Our Democracy podcast, created by us, the nonprofit, nonpartisan, pro-democracy group, We the Veterans and Military Families. In this series, we explore what it means to be a citizen, what veterans and military families' roles are in supporting and defending our Constitution following military service, and how you can get more involved to help create a more perfect union. We're all in this democracy thing together, and it's important for all of us to know our rights and our responsibilities to each other. As citizens, we need to know how our government is supposed to work so we can engage patriotically and positively to bring about the best version of America. So if you care about America, democracy, baseball, mom, and apple pie, this is the podcast for you. Today's episode is all about the role of the press in a properly functioning democracy, considering that our realities beyond the range of our five senses are constructed from the information we consume, what the early 20th century thinker Walter Lippmann called the world outside and the pictures in our heads. It is especially important for citizens to receive good, true information about current events and public affairs, so they can make the best decisions about who our leaders are, what policies should be enacted, what laws should be made, and how our society should operate. With all the challenges facing our country and world today, it is more important than ever that people get timely and accurate information about the issues they care about. Joining us today for this very important discussion are Thom Shanker, the director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University's School for Media and Public Affairs, and Kelly S. Kennedy, the managing editor for The Warhorse, a nonprofit investigative newsroom covering military and veteran issues. I first met Thom in the bowels of the Pentagon around 2010 when he was a New York Times correspondent covering the Department of Defense. And I met Kelly around 2016 when she and my wife collaborated to write a book about how female Marines are trained. Both have traveled extensively to multiple combat zones covering the post-9/11 wars and risked their lives to tell the stories of young Americans at war and the political decisions that put them in harm's way. Both are incredibly accomplished journalists and authors with very interesting new books out, which we'll talk about later. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So without further ado, Thom, Kelly, and Ellen, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, since today's discussion is really about the role of the press in democracy, I'd just like to get your thoughts to start on why America and arguably the world needs a vigorous, curious, and free press.
Sure, I'll jump in here. Joe, an informed electorate is really important to the strength of a democracy. I've spent much of my life living in dictatorships, 5 years in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, into Iraq and other places when they were either dictatorial or just post-dictatorial. And I'm not sure I'd go as far as Thomas Jefferson, who said, if I had to choose between a government or a free press, I'd pick the free press, because I think there is a partnership there. But I think especially in the issues that all of us care about, there's no decision that a democracy makes that is more grim or more serious than going to war. And so a free media plays this incredibly important role in informing the public about what the government is doing in its name, with its tax dollars, with the weapons it's buying, and most importantly, how it's going to send men and women, citizens, sons, daughters, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, into harm's way. And Joe, all those years at the Pentagon, when you were working in public affairs and I was working for the New York Times, we had a great professional rapport. It was always professional. There was a lot of rub there, but you understood the basic premise of maximum disclosure with minimum delay. That's where the government should be. And the media, a free media, should be on the side of getting it first, but first getting it right, and always to contribute to an informed electorate.
Thank you. It couldn't have said it better myself. I think that, Thom, that's it's spot on. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely spot on. But I would say after getting out of the military, I always thought of my role as being a reporter is continuing to look out for my guys, which plays into that too. This idea that the government is acting in our name. Well, how are the troops being taken care of? What's the aftermath of that? What will voting look like in the future when we're thinking about wars, when we're thinking about harmful effects on troops from toxic exposure or the war itself? Like, can we think past just the immediate? What's the long term?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things I heard a lot from military commanders over the years was essentially the sentiment that why should I talk to the press? They would ask this question almost like they didn't see one, they didn't look forward to, because I think they kind of saw it as all risk, no reward. Two, with the imperative that the military places on classification and operational security, they saw that as a risk as well. But three, there was almost an arrogance there of like, well, I don't have to talk to these folks. And, it was kind of like our job as public affairs folks, but also, the civilian leadership of the departments really a lot of times would weigh in and say, no, you really are going to answer the American people on what our young men and women are doing around the world. So, how did you overcome that when you were working as reporters and still are, covering the military? And I know, Tom, you just recently, or maybe not so recently, left the New York Times, but fairly recently. How did you overcome that inertia or that resistance?
Sure, I would just make I would make the case that the relationship between the military and the media is like a marriage. Now, it's a dysfunctional marriage to be sure, but we stay together for the kids. Now, what do I mean by that? My kids in this horrible analogy are the American people, citizens, taxpayers, voters. The kids to the commanders are the troops under their command who need, and the commanders understand keeping public support requires communicating with the public about what they're doing. I respect their constraints of secrecy, but I think all of us are very familiar with overclassification. But no reporter, or at least very few reporters, set out with the goal of, I'm going to go declassify something today. No, the goal is I'm going to write a story that informs the American people. And if it rubs up against classification, well, there are processes at the New York Times, at other places, Warhorse, to deal with that in conversation. It's never unilateral. It's part of the conversation. But that's like the stalking horse issue, Joe. Classification is not the biggest issue that comes up in the military media relationship. It's access. It's the flow of information, and most commanders get it. And as an individual, reporters have access because of their reputation. If you do good stories, you get good access. If you do bad stories, and I don't mean good or bad from the military's point of view, I mean good or bad as far as accuracy, importance, the things that we hold dear. Not you judging us, but us judging ourselves.
I was going to say, if you can get your story right, there's no reason to the military can't come back at you with, you've got it completely screwed up and you shouldn't have done it. But it also means that the troops trust you and may bring you information that can help the force, the nation, the guys. It's so important to get it right. That's the best way to overcome any problems.
Well, I was gonna be super nerdy as a citizen in this discussion and say, one of the first times that I heard the phrase "the Fourth Estate," I thought it was really wonky and weird, in a political science class. But actually, the phrase and the expression "the fourth power" is in almost every major European language, and in most democracies, it's considered the other thing. There's obviously the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, but then what about the rest of us? Like, how do we play in that? And I think we've gotten so lost in this conversation about, someone's bias, instead of realizing that the whole point of this here is that as citizens of any country where there's all these different people in power, we don't have any way other than through people that are paid to do this job to find out about those people in power, what they're doing, what their decisions they're making, what they don't want us to know, what background we need to sort of analyze those decisions. So, and I would also say that as a military spouse, there's an interesting and maybe fraught sense that, is this journalist going to do something that endangers, military members or whatever? But hopefully not. And as a citizen, we have to rely on these people to tell us a more complete story about what's going on and what our family members are engaged in. What's the why? What's the, how should we put this in the context of American history? I mean, there's all these elements that we could never possibly know ourselves, and that are incredibly important.
And it always sort of amazed me that, the military is so smart about all of the domains: land, sea, air, cyberspace. Now there's a space force, that they tend to shy away from or even be cowardly about the information space. And this is not about information operations or psyops, but just engaging with the public in the information space. Military commanders never run from the sound of fire. They don't let weather stop them. So why on earth are they so cowardly around somebody with a pad and a pencil?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well said. I've got some pretty strong feelings about that. I think, it's what you're describing to me is the difference between physical and moral courage, right? It's one thing to back up your friend who's being mugged or, chase a robber down the street. It's another thing when you know that politics might swing in your face and you might have some personal consequences for telling the truth, right? And that's a whole other calculus where, the military being very hierarchical, sometimes, left to its own devices can be a very go along to get along type of group, right? And so it's also a monkey see, monkey do thing. So like if you have a inspired service chief or commandant who is out there and the troops see them engaging with the media, there's a trickle down effect to that where other commanders, will follow suit, especially if the expectations laid from the top. If they're not doing that, we had a recent chairman who ducked the press, for his entire time he was in office. And I called him out in an article in an op-ed in the Washington Post, but it's just like, I'm sorry, like, you are at your terminal rank, you owe it to us to speak. And if you don't, it's like the first time you want to meet the press isn't when a disaster is on your hands. It's like, you got to build those relationships ahead of time. Right. So, that's why, Tom, when you talk about it being a marriage, yeah, absolutely. Because, marriages are based on trust and relationships with the media are based on trust. And I took great umbrage, and still to this day, at folks who kind of disregard or malign the entire media as a group, right? Because it's like anytime you say all people in fill in the blank group exhibit fill in the blank kind of behavior, I guarantee you're going to be 100% wrong all the time, right? So, I mean, it's just like bias, prejudice, stereotypes, and the rest of it. And encourage people to think past that and say, hey, it's like, I've had awesome relationships with reporters. I embedded over 100 in Iraq for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and was directed to arrest one and take them off the battlefield because they were giving away the position of one of our regimental combat teams on live air. And not super proud of that moment in my life and being directed to do that, but I'll still take 99 out of 100 still an A+ in any school that you go to, right? So, yeah, Kelly, what thoughts do you have?
Well, I was thinking about the long term from that, how often you hear civilians don't understand, or there's the military civilian divide. So at the same time that we complain that there aren't enough veterans out in the world, as soon as a civilian asks us questions, we say things like, well, you wouldn't understand. And if your commandant or your general has been saying, I'm not going to talk to the media for all these years, then why should I talk to civilians? Why should I explain what I've been through when even as a service member, I represent the civilian population in the vote? So,
But Joe, it's interesting. You talked about how there is no the media because we're not a homogenous group. Well, guess what? There's no the military either. And that's one of the things that reporters who really covered the Pentagon for years and decades understand. And it's part of our job to be not your ambassadors, but your translators, your interpreters. And that's a lot of what we did. And I joke that, as you know, Joe, from your time in the public affairs shop, there are reporters at the Pentagon today, whose first story was probably the dividing of the Red Sea and the Israelites being chased by the Egyptians, right? That's how long they've been on the beat. No other beat in Washington. The White House, they pass through, it's getting the ticket stamped, State Department, Congress, everywhere else. But the Pentagon tends to attract reporters who become experts in their own right. And you know who they are: the Michael Gordons of the world, the Tom Rickses of the world, the Eric Schmidts of the world. These are people who, are as knowledgeable about the military as many of the commanders they're interviewing.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Tom Ricks, who's a favorite of mine and provided me some wise advice over the years. But like, it was funny because when he wrote Making of the Core, they were like, "Oh, he's great, we love him." And then he wrote Hubris, and they're like, "Oh, we don't like him so much because he's showing our warts and strategic failures." Right. So, but I think the check that, there's an accountability factor, right? When we talk about like the free press and holding power to account, because we, the people, can't possibly even understand what's going on unless somebody's telling that to us, right? And so, can I get your thoughts on that a little bit? Like, where have you seen in your time reporting that you've been able to, by telling the stories factually, been able to hold people's feet to the fire and help guide them? Essentially, I see the press is putting like the bumpers and the gutters on the bowling alley. It's like done right. It's like, yes, people are watching, so let's make sure that you're bowling down the center, right? Can you talk to me about that?
I mean, the PACT Act, of course, is the first thing that comes to mind, writing about the burn pits in 2008 and finally having that come to fruition. But the other one that comes to mind is when I was in Iraq in 2007. I was with a unit that was hit really hard, and they were serving 15-month tours, and their commander had been turned out right in the middle of his tour over there. We wrote about those things, and the next thing we knew, they weren't doing middle of combat tour shift overs with the commanders, and they weren't doing 15-month tours anymore. So, your reporting can have an immediate change, and immediate change for real people, not just for the government or whatever.
Yeah, and for folks that might not be as familiar with it, the PACT Act is related to the burn pits that were being burned in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of vets came home very sick from that. But due to the way the law and VA regulations were written, you couldn't get medical care for inhalation-related injuries and sicknesses and cancers because the burden of proof was so high. If I understand that correctly, Kelly, is that right?
That was part of it, but also acknowledging that it was a problem to begin with was a problem.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, but 19-year-olds shouldn't be coming back from battlefields with like glioblastoma and clusters, right? Like weird brain cancers and all sorts of other things. So,
or asthma.
yeah. But like, had the press, namely you and others, not broken that story, would those vets be getting care today? I don't know. I mean, that's a really interesting thing to think about. And Tom, like, where have you seen the powerful being held to account through the press?
Sure. I mean, there's so many examples, Joe. Dana Priest's groundbreaking work on failures at Walter Reed that she wrote for the Washington Post. My colleague Dave Phillips at the Times had stories just last week about brain injuries from units in Syria who were firing historic numbers of artillery rounds. Those sorts of things. And I guess too, let's not forget that reporters play a role in holding the world to account.
Yeah.
On behalf of Americans. I mean, the story I'm proudest of breaking in my entire career was during my years covering the awful ethnic wars in Bosnia after the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. I was the reporter who first wrote about the Serbian campaign of systematic mass rape of Muslim women.
Oof.
That was in parallel with my friend Roy Gutman of Newsday, who 2 weeks before broke the story about the Serb death camps. Now, this was after the fall of communism. There was, where's this peace dividend people were looking for? Nobody wanted to focus on the plight of Muslims in Southern Europe. But it was reporting like that that forced the world to pay attention and act. And we put a little bit of justice back in the world because those stories drove the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague to finally file charges and to send then the U.S. military in to start hunting and finding these bad guys. So for sure, this podcast, you veterans, military spouse, should focus on the U.S. military, as you should. These are our people, but the media also plays a role in trying to repair the world as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
So,
think, go ahead, Ellen.
well, I was gonna ask a question because it's so interesting to hear your two perspectives. Obviously, Kelly, knowing that you served on active duty before becoming a reporter that covers this space, and Thom, you've obviously served covering this space for a very, very long time. I'm curious if there's sort of any nuance between how you may sort of do your respective jobs, you know, coming from very much within, but now Thom, you've been almost within for you know for your career as well. I'm just curious about that distinction. It's something we look into just because of the trust automatically given to someone who is a veteran, and if that plays out for in your own experiences.
Yeah, I always joke that when I was covering cops, I didn't have to be a criminal, to cover cops. When I was covering education, I didn't have to be an educator to cover education. I think a lot of the guys at the Pentagon know a lot more about the military than I do. And people do assume that as a veteran, you've got some great knowledge, but I came out as a Spec 4. I was in for 4 years. I was 23 years old when I got out, and I knew nothing. And, interviewing Petraeus was terrifying. And so I think that you get granted a little bit of trust because people know that you are willing to be part of the SOC. But if you're covering the military, then you're willing to be in the SOC too. So,
Right.
So I think there is a value in, obviously, the military experience, not just having served our nation, but in making you a better reporter. People like Chris Chivers, T.M. Gibbons-Neff. The New York Times consciously sought out veterans for their experience and expertise, and they elevated the entire report. But as Kelly said, you don't have to be a veteran to cover the military. And if you're on the beat 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 years, I think you've earned the right to ask the tough questions. And one of the great things before DOD began being a little more cyber savvy, there were majors I met on my first Special Forces embed in Kandahar in 2001 who kept the same emails when they pinned their first star on their shoulder. So you could always find them. Now, that's no longer true, Joe, as you know. They've been rotating the email addresses. But, these officers would respond over the years. You develop relationships with them, and it's all built on trust. But that takes time, and it takes having a reputation for accuracy and honesty.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. Dana's story about Walter Reed, I was covering it at the same time. We were kind of going in at the same time. And I walked in and saw the mold on the walls and thought, barracks, because as someone had served, I missed something that a civilian would see. On the other hand, on the burn pit story, when Dan Clare was pitching that out to civilian reporters, they thought the Army would never do anything that blatantly obvious that was wrong. And I thought, that's not the Army I remember. So it can play both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And I think, I'm grateful because, I have friends who, are going to the VA right now to get care for burn pit related illnesses. And if it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for folks like Patty Kime, who, broke the story and kept on beating that drum, right? It's just like, I really don't think that hundreds of thousands of veterans would be getting care today because of that. Because, it's just like, it's so funny how, Congress can find a ton of money for going to war and for the Raytheons and BAEs and Textrons and all the rest of them. But when it comes down to, hey, we need a few billion to take care of these veterans who are sick from, toxins on the battlefield, they're like, oh, what's the pay for? Like, come on. It's there's a moral responsibility that extends. And that's, one of the things when they were talking about privatizing the VA, a lot of us were like, nope, you're not going to do that because it's not just a healthcare system. And yes, it is large and yes, it is complicated, but it is a physical reminder of our duty to the men and women who fight our wars, right? I mean,
Well said.
it's, in brick and mortar, right? In every state in the country and territory. So, no, that's good. I think one of the things, you hear about, well, the press gets it wrong, or I don't even know what to believe anymore, is a comment that came up, and both at Brookings and then also talking to my father over the weekend. He's like, I don't even know what to believe on the news anymore. And I'm like, well, that's a problem when Americans can't decipher fact from fiction, right? Could you talk to me? I've heard journalism talk kind of described as the first draft of history in a way. Could you talk to us about what are your thoughts on that? Like, how does the process eventually get it right, even if the first story's off or wrong or doesn't have all the facts? I mean, first reports rarely are 100% accurate, but how does the truth eventually come out through the process of journalism?
Well, Kelly mentioned that she was a police reporter. Most of us of our generation were. My first journalism job was night cops in Oklahoma City. And my best editor, a guy named Mike Shannon, taught me get it first, but first get it right. And I think that, to your father, Joe, and to those who talk about, I don't know who I can believe, I really have to politely and respectfully disagree with them. I think if you look to the mainstream respected media, and a lot of the newer online organizations, they do get it right most of the time. What breaks my heart, and I use that word completely knowing what it means, what breaks my heart is that traditional, accurate, honest, fair journalism is being lumped into this whole fake news world and social media. I'm an absolutist when it comes to the First Amendment. Everybody has a right to say what they think, but discerning consumers of news have to know the difference between the New York Times and some blogger on the street, between the war horse and some website posted by some chucklehead at his mom's table eating Cheerios in his boxer shorts. And unfortunately, it's the conflation of this whole media universe that is the problem.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and how would you? Oh, I want to hear Kelly's thoughts, but I'm curious for both of you. If it's like if you're saying trusted journalist, picture 101, I'm curious how both of you would tell a listener, a citizen, how to define what a trusted journalist is. It used to be easier because the most trusted person in America was Walter Cronkite, right? I mean, it was easy. We knew that he was saying something, that people were paid to do the research to back up what he was saying. Somehow now that looks like it's not trustworthy.
I think when I hear someone say that they don't trust the news, the first question I always ask is, what's your source? What are you reading? What's the newspaper you read every day? And usually people don't have an answer for that. So I feel like if you want to trust the news, then you have to put some work into it. You have to find a good news source, and there's a million resources online that say, here's where they fall right down the middle, here's where they're a little over here, here's where they're over here. But you need to put in the work. You need to find a source that you trust and watch it. But also you can pick more than one, like even during the hospital bombing in Israel, if you were watching more than one source or reading more than one source, then you knew there was confusion and no one really knew exactly yet what was going on. And then all the headlines started to make sense. I don't think picking one headline and then saying this place is bad or this place is great is the way to do it. I think you have to put the work in.
Yeah. I mean, and I love that because, from the military aspect, what you're talking about is open source intelligence, right? You don't just take one report and say, okay, well, this is what's happening, or the enemy's doing this, or the leader of Iran's doing this from one single report. You're going to go to multiple sources and multiple periodicals, multiple points of information and compare them, right? And see where are the discrepancies? Where does it start to rhyme to build the story of what's happening? And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I've heard some people describe it as get your news like a salad bar. Like, don't eat just all potatoes or all beets. Like, get a little bit from each and take a look around and see. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's even organizations out there like Ad Fontes who actually rate news organizations, right? You know, they you can kind of see where they sit, right or left of center, and are they more factual or opinion based? And so that's kind of interesting and exciting.
Yeah.
Or misinformation. It'll tell you that too.
Yeah.
Well, and in a perfect world, what Kelly, what you and Joe are saying, would work. Unfortunately, we are not even in the, first best option and a second best world here. I mean, people love only getting the news they already know they want to know about. People only want to have their biases affirmed. So rather than, the Walter Cronkite School, the New York Times School that gives you a full plate, so you don't have to go to the buffet. People only want the daily me. And how we spin back time to where people do what you, Kelly, and Joe are saying. I mean, I wish it was tomorrow, but I'm afraid the era is gone where people are energetic, open-minded, adventurous consumers of news. And that's why we see the incredible polarization we have in our country today. And I guarantee you all know this. We are weaker as a polarized nation than when we are together.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah, we've got a saying around we, the veterans and military families. It's like when Americans are at each other's throats and tearing at each other, we're doing our nation's enemy's job for them.
True.
Because the folks in Moscow are laughing, the folks in Beijing are laughing, the folks in Tehran are laughing every time they see Americans tearing each other apart over social issues, right? So can you tell me, because I see it less in print and more in broadcast media, but like the conflation between news and opinion, where certain networks have like dedicated news segments and newsrooms, right? And the news comes on at like noon and typically 6 and 8 in the morning. But in between those news broadcasts is a whole lot of opinion and a whole lot of celebrity talking heads. And I can understand from a certain perspective how it gets confusing. Like, am I listening to the news broadcast or am I listening to somebody's opinion about what's happening in the news? How can we navigate that better?
Turn off your TV.
Shoot your television.
Yeah, I mean, not only because I have a face made for radio, but it just, again, it breaks my heart that the television landscape is really being driven by these market shares. I mean, you have Fox on the right and MSNBC on the left, and CNN struggling to figure out where it fits. And my problem with Fox, again, I'm an absolutist when it comes to the First Amendment. So Fox wants to skew right. If MSNBC wants to skew left, I support that. But the problem is this: when Fox says it's fair and balanced, even during the opinion sections when it's not, its viewers then come away thinking that everybody can be as biased as that and still claim to be fair and balanced. And I know people criticize the New York Times for being left of center. The editorial page is, but our news columns are only aggressive in going after the truth. And those in power always see those as coming after them as being from the left. But Fox and MSNBC, secondarily, have trained Americans that bias in your news is what news is.
Right.
And that is so bad for our country.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think it's something where, as an industry, major news organizations could do a lot to help people if they wanted to, by just even putting in the lower third of the TV, right? This is an opinion section, or having opinion versus this is the news section, right? Because there are journalists over at Fox to this day I still correspond with that I have good relationships with, that I know they're straight shooters, right? Jennifer Griffin being one of them, who is not afraid to tell the truth. And even when it flies in the face of politics at her organization. So, and I think in newspapers, it's, that the editorial page is kind of, page 27 near the back, and, it's a big masthead, opinion in that part. So yeah, I think newspapers do a lot better job of making that bifurcation. But could you talk, I think a lot of Americans are confused because they don't even understand how there's a separation within news organizations, that opinion and news folks typically don't even talk to each other. Is that correct? Did I have that right?
Very much so. Absolutely. I mean, the opinion pages don't call us for background. I mean, they do. They at my alma mater, I'm no longer part of that we, but there is a church state divide between the opinion and the news section.
Yeah.
I've been in newsrooms where they call the reporters in to sort of interview them. The editorial board will just to get background information, but we weren't part of their decision and they weren't telling us what they were thinking, but we were just there to help inform their decisions. So.
Yeah.
So I have a question just about, again, as a citizen, but also as a military spouse. How do you feel about, the last 20 something years of coverage was obviously, if you were covering the military, you were covering war. And, how do you feel your role and your sort of, comrades in Penn's role, what impact do you think the stories, the TV, the writing about the last 20 something years of war, what impact did it have on the way Americans perceive the war and maybe even, our taste for war, our interest in continuing?
That's a huge one. I mean, I feel like reporters did a pretty good job of reporting on Iraq and Afghanistan, and it didn't necessarily feel like I don't necessarily feel like it changed the outcome. It felt a lot like, as we were saying, this thing is going wrong, or you need to tell us more about this, or you've taken out all the infrastructure in Iraq. Now what? Those things didn't necessarily change, and we still ended up in the place we ended up. So as far as how it affected government policy, not overall in the big way it needed to. Public opinion, I don't believe we have a taste for war right now, but that changes as people forget. So I don't know. That probably didn't seem very hopeful.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. I think, Ellen, the most specific answer I can give you is how it affected the reporters. I was in newsrooms. I'm old enough to have been in the newsrooms in the 70s when the draft ended. I had to register, so I was with Selective Service. But in the 70s, when the draft ended, newsrooms suddenly began flushing out all their veterans just because they aged out. Those from World War II, Korea, Vietnam. So from the mid to late 70s up until 9/11, newsrooms had fewer and fewer veterans with each passing year. And that's not good because you want reporters to understand the different parts of our society. So for better or worse, the forever wars did inject back into newsrooms at every organization across America, small town papers, mid-size, the elite press, people, men and women who had covered war, traveled with the military, had military comrades in arms. And that, I think, created empathy, not bias, but empathy and knowledge that makes the report better.
That makes sense. I remember reading Embedded when I was in school, in grad school, before I went back into reporting as a military reporter, and just being blown away by how sort of naive it felt compared to what reporting feels like today. So.
I think one thing, when you talk about especially war correspondence, I mean, definitely have a special place in my heart, having lived through the 03 embed process, where I think we probably had more reporters traveling with servicemen and women since maybe World War II, maybe Vietnam. I mean, it's been a good long time since the press had that access to the military. And thinking, these folks are coming to tell our story and risking their lives to do it, right? There's no guarantee that they're going to go back home to their families when they're embedded in infantry platoons and companies. I mean, right at the point of contact, to the point where, there's a guy, an author, a very prominent author, was supposed to go with 1st Reconnaissance Battalion. And after he got the nuclear, biological, chemical brief and the VX agent and what it does to your body and all that stuff, he came to me and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." He said, "I've got a family back home." And I said, "Hey, it's no shame." I said, "You're always welcome. The door's open." And the guy that they sent me after Hampton left was Evan Wright. And that's how the whole Generation Kill got started, right? So, and Evan, is willing to go forward. But, I think about, Tom and I were kind of talking a little bit before we started the recording. And maybe this is kind of like a good one kind of final thought before we wrap it up, is that covering war has an impact on the reporters just like it does on the troops. In many cases, whether it's physical injuries like Bob Woodruff or Kim Dozier, or folks who have left pieces of their bodies on battlefields while covering war, or not coming home at all, or just having gone to combat one too many times. I mean, how do you as reporters kind of work through that? I mean, you've both been downrange. What's being done for reporters? Because I think there's a lot more being done for vets in this regard.
Kelly, do you want to start? Do you want me to go first? What's your...
Sure. I am part of the DART Center for Trauma Journalists. And they bring journalists who cover trauma out for a week to talk about how being essentially a first responder without the respect is tough. It's really hard. You see a lot of the same things that first responders see. But they always give as an example the hurricane in New Orleans, where on the sides of the roads there'd be free food, free water, no reporters welcome, even though that's also where the reporters lived, and it was also the reporters' homes. I would say it affects people exactly the same way. A lot of us came back with PTS or depression. You see sad things, you get sad. So there are several organizations now set up where reporters are trying to help each other. There's more knowledge within the newsroom. If I see one of my reporters needs a day off, I say take a day off. I ask what they need, try to be open-minded, open-eared about what they're going through in a way that I didn't really have with my editors starting out as a cops reporter, where they were just like, go do it. And no one ever asked you how you were afterwards. So.
For sure.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a cliche, but the saying goes that if you go off to cover a war, the war covers you. And the thing about the forever wars, reporters have been covering conflict for most of their adult lives. I mean, World War II was intense, global, but it was relatively short by comparison. I was going in and out of Iraq for 13 years. And that was after spending 2 years in Bosnia. The reporters that we've mentioned, I mean, our colleagues and friends are still out there covering Ukraine and Gaza. And that's with Libya in the middle, and Syria. And what people who haven't either served in the military or covered conflict, what they don't understand, they always think that the PTSD or the stress or whatever comes from the day or days when the artillery shell landed close by, or you heard the bullet whizzing by your ear. Okay, those are profound experiences, to be sure. But what I tell people is that every foot patrol in Kandahar, every time you roll out of a forward operating base in Iraq, your soul gets sandpapered, because this could be the last thing you ever do. And the accumulation of that, I'm not downplaying the bullet whizzing by your ear or the rocket attacks on where you're staying, but it's that day after day continuous sandpapering of the soul that people who haven't lived that life don't understand.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, you're not going to the safe places. So even as an embed, you're not going in with the unit that's like not getting hit. You're going in with the unit that's getting hit. So.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I was so grateful for that experience in 2003, having been able to plan and execute, I think, the largest media embed program that 1st Marine Division certainly has ever had. Because it showed me, like, I was just blown away. I was like, these folks are coming here of their own free will. Like, some Marines, I bet you, if you said, hey, pal, would you rather go home? They'd be like, yeah, I'd rather go home right now. But there they were, and, I think of, Scott McWhinney from CNN, just out in the middle of the street with his video camera, his bullets are zinging by and RPGs are flying everywhere. And, I mean, some incredible acts of bravery on the parts of the press to cover that war. And, And not just that, but even small things like, we had no communications whatsoever, but, for NBC to toss a sat phone to a Marine, machine gunner and say, call your mom and let her know you're okay. Right. Little things like that most people haven't seen and don't even really understand. Like, that was a gift, right? That was a gift. And for America to be able to see and know like what unit was where and who was embedded with First LAR and the rest of them, like they were able to kind of follow their Marines, and soldiers and everybody right through the entire conflict. And I hope that if God forbid we ever go to war again, that the press still has that kind of access, right? But this has been a fantastic conversation. I could keep on going. I want to ask you like one thing. I think the most important thing we might have talked about is like, how do you decipher fact from fiction? If you could just each give me like one good tactic, one good actionable thing people can do to kind of cut through the fog and get to the truth. What do you think?
I grew up in the Chicago school, Joe, where they say, if your mother says she loves you, check it out.
I love that. Get a second source. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Just more than one source. If it sounds like it's nonsense, it probably is. So like the conspiracy theory thing. If it sounds nuts, it's nuts. Like, check it out.
I had somebody ask me yesterday, they like, you're in the military, I'd be like, hey, what about those UFOs? And I'm like, my God, I said, like as bad as we are as keeping secrets, like no way. Like, there's just no way. I mean, oh my God. Yeah. I think people watch too many Hollywood movies thinking that, we have a national secret and it's airtight. I mean, something like that's going to get out for sure. So, yeah. And I think the other thing I would say is if you're feeling fear, right? You watch it, you read something in the press, you see something on TV and you're feeling fear, take a deep breath, pause and ask yourself, to whose benefit is my fear, right? Because we know that when we are afraid and our fight or flight mechanisms kick in our brains, our thinking, rational part of our brain literally shuts down, and we can see that in functional MRI. So like, I know as a longtime communicator and student of propaganda, if you can make somebody afraid, you can manipulate them. So, and fear sells. It sells like a drug. So I'd say be brave. Be brave when reading the news. Take a breath. Check it out. So thank you. Thank you so much for coming in today. I know both of you lead very busy lives, and, I lean on you quite a bit from time to time. And I'm so grateful for you and your colleagues. I would just encourage people listening to think about, before you malign the press, just know that there is a whole core of veteran press, people who or war correspondents who have been traveling with young men and women in the military since the revolution and risking their lives to do it. And we all owe them a deep debt of gratitude. So thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast episode interesting or useful, please share it with the people you know. This episode was co-hosted by Joe Plunzler and Ellen Gustafson. The audio and video were edited by Cameron King. Vet Our Democracy is a production of We the Veterans and Military Families, a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan, pro-democracy organization focused on promoting positive and patriotic civic engagement to strengthen American democracy. Find out more about us at wetheveterans.us and follow us on social media. Kelly, Thom, thank you so much for your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.